Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her peaceful weekend retreat to the remote Colorado mountains would become a fight for 3 lives. What started as a simple getaway to her late grandfather's cabin turned into an impossible choice between survival and surrender, with flames closing in and 2 tiny hearts beating inside her. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, help arrives from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old logging road to Grandfather Mitchell's cabin had always been rough, but Sarah hadn't remembered it being quite this treacherous. Her Honda Civic bounced and scraped over rocks and fallen branches as she navigated the winding path through dense pine forests. At 36 weeks pregnant with twins, every jolt sent a sharp reminder through her swollen belly that this trip might not have been her brightest idea. But she needed this. After months of bed rest orders, doctor appointments, and her husband, David's increasingly suffocating attention, Sarah craved solitude. The cabin had been her sanctuary as a child, a place where she'd spent countless summers learning to fish with Grandpa Joe and helping Grandma Rose tend her wildflower garden. Now, 2 years after inheriting the property, she finally had the chance to visit and decide whether to keep it or sell. David had been furious when she announced her plans. They'd argued for hours in their Denver apartment, his voice rising as he listed every possible disaster that could befall a heavily pregnant woman alone in the wilderness. But Sarah's mind was made up. She promised to stay only 2 nights, to keep her phone charged, and to drive straight home if she felt even the slightest discomfort. "These babies aren't due for another month," she'd told him, patting her enormous belly. "I'll be fine." The cabin appeared through the trees just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountain peaks. It looked smaller than Sarah remembered, with weathered cedar siding and a stone chimney that needed repairs. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on one corner, and several roof shingles lay scattered in the tall grass that had overtaken Grandma Rose's once pristine garden. Sarah parked beside the old water pump and struggled out of the car, her back aching from the 3-hour drive. The mountain air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else, something acrid that made her wrinkle her nose, probably just the remnants of someone's campfire from down the valley. Inside, the cabin was frozen in time. Dust motes danced in shafts of golden sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. Grandpa Joe's fly fishing gear still hung on pegs beside the stone fireplace, and Grandma Rose's mason jars lined the kitchen shelves like colorful soldiers. The electricity had been shut off years ago, but the old wood-burning stove still worked, and Sarah had brought plenty of supplies. She spent the afternoon settling in, sweeping mouse droppings from the floors and airing out musty bedding. The physical activity felt good after weeks of forced inactivity. The babies seemed to approve too, their kicks less restless than they'd been during the drive. By evening, she had a fire crackling in the stove and a simple dinner of canned soup warming on the stovetop. The first night passed peacefully. Sarah slept better than she had in weeks, lulled by the absolute silence that only true wilderness could provide. No traffic, no neighbors, no David tossing and turning beside her while muttering about quarterly reports in his sleep. Just the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. She woke the next morning feeling refreshed and optimistic. Maybe she wouldn't sell the cabin after all. Maybe this could be a place where her children could experience the same magical summers she'd known. She could picture them splashing in the creek, building fairy houses from moss and twigs, learning to identify constellations in the unpolluted night sky. The second day began with promise. Sarah took a gentle walk around the property, noting needed repairs and imagining improvements. The old tire swing still hung from the massive oak beside the creek, though the rope looked ready to snap. The vegetable garden was completely overrun, but the soil beneath the weeds still looked rich and dark. She was standing beside the creek, watching minnows dart between the rocks, when the first contraction hit. It started as a tightening across her lower back, nothing more intense than the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. Sarah breathed through it and continued her walk. False alarms were common at this stage. Dr. Patterson had warned her that twin pregnancies often involved more frequent practice contractions. But 20 minutes later, another one gripped her, stronger this time, and unmistakably different from the mild cramping she'd grown accustomed to. This one made her double over, gasping as pain radiated from her spine around to her swollen belly. Sarah made her way back to the cabin, trying to stay calm. It was probably nothing. Stress from the long drive, maybe, or too much activity yesterday. She would rest, drink some water, and the contractions would subside. They didn't subside. By noon, they were coming every 15 minutes with clockwork regularity. Sarah tried calling David, but her phone showed no signal. She'd known cell service was spotty up here, but she'd managed to send him a text yesterday evening. Now, when she actually needed to reach the outside world, the mountains had swallowed her voice completely. The contractions were getting stronger, each one forcing her to grip the edge of the kitchen table and breathe in short, sharp pants. This wasn't false labor. This was the real thing, happening a month too early and 50 miles from the nearest hospital. Sarah forced herself to think rationally. First, babies often took many hours to arrive, and she was having twins, which could complicate things, but also might mean more time. If she left now, she could make it to town before active labor began. The dirt road would be hell to navigate while contracting, but her Honda was reliable, and she was still mobile between pains. She threw her belongings into her overnight bag, with shaking hands, pausing every few minutes to breathe through the increasing intensity of each contraction. The car keys felt slippery in her sweaty palm as she locked the cabin door and hurried toward her vehicle. That's when she smelled the smoke. It wasn't the pleasant, woodsy scent she'd noticed yesterday. This was thick and sharp, the unmistakable smell of a wildfire. Sarah looked toward the valley and felt her heart sink. A wall of grey smoke was rising above the tree line to the south, and she could see the orange glow of flames dancing between. The pine trunks, the logging road she'd used to reach the cabin, wound directly through that valley. Another contraction seized her, this one so powerful it dropped her to her knees beside the car. When it passed, she struggled upright and tried to assess her options. The main road was blocked by fire, but there was an old Forest Service trail that connected to the highway about 20 miles north. She'd hiked it with Grandpa Joe as a teenager. It was rough and barely wide enough for a vehicle, but it might be passable. Sarah climbed into the Honda and started the engine, praying the old trail was still accessible. The contractions were coming every 10 minutes now, each one requiring her complete attention. She had to time her driving between pains, pulling over when each wave hit and gripping the steering wheel until it passed. The Forest Service trail was worse than she remembered. What had once been a hiking path was now little more than twin. Ruts carved by all-terrain vehicles. Low-hanging branches scraped the roof of her car, and twice she had to get out to move fallen logs that blocked the way. Each physical effort brought another contraction, stronger than the last. She'd been driving for an hour when she heard the first tree fall behind her. The sound was unmistakable, a tremendous crack, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the ground. Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror and saw smoke beginning to filter through the trees behind her. The fire was moving faster than she'd anticipated, feeding on the drought-dried forest and pushed by afternoon winds. Another tree fell, this one closer, and Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator despite the rough terrain. The Honda scraped over rocks and bounced through potholes as she raced against the advancing flames. She could see clearer sky ahead, which meant she was approaching the highway. Just a few more miles, The contraction that hit her then was unlike anything she'd experienced. It started deep in her back and wrapped around her entire torso like a vice, squeezing with such intensity that she couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, and the car veered toward a massive pine tree. Sarah slammed on the brakes and felt the Honda slide sideways in the loose dirt. The rear wheel caught in a hidden ditch, and despite her desperate attempts to rock the car free, she was stuck fast. Behind her, the smoke was getting thicker, and she could hear the distant roar of flames consuming the forest. She was trapped between a growing wildfire and labor that was progressing far too quickly. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried once more to move the car, revving the engine until it screamed in protest. The wheels spun uselessly in the soft earth, digging deeper with each attempt. The smell of burning rubber mixed with wood smoke, creating a toxic cocktail that made her gag. Another contraction seized her, and this time she felt something she'd only read about in pregnancy books, the unmistakable urge to push. Terror flooded through her as she realized what was happening. The babies weren't waiting for a hospital or a doctor, or even for her to reach safety. They were coming now, in the middle of nowhere, with a wildfire bearing down on her position. Sarah abandoned the car and grabbed her overnight bag, knowing she had to find shelter. The highway was still at least 2 miles away through thick forest, impossible to reach on foot in her condition. But she remembered something from her childhood explorations with Grandpa Joe. There was another cabin somewhere in this area, an old hunting lodge that might provide protection from the fire. She stumbled through the underbrush, following what might have been a game trail, pausing every few minutes when contractions forced her to double over in pain. The smoke was getting thicker, stinging her eyes and making it hard to breathe. Ash began falling like grey snow, coating the pine needles and her dark hair with fine particles. The hunting lodge appeared through the haze like a mirage. It was larger than Grandpa's cabin, but in much worse repair, with broken windows and a roof that sagged dangerously in the middle. But the stone foundation looked solid, and the clearing around it might provide some protection from the approaching fire. Sarah stumbled up the front steps just as another massive contraction hit. This one brought an unmistakable feeling of pressure and wetness, and she realized her water had broken. The fluid soaked through her jeans and ran down her legs as she fumbled with the cabin door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door was unlocked, swinging open to reveal a space that hadn't been occupied in years. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled of mold and mouse droppings. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. She spread her sleeping bag on the floor near the stone fireplace, the cleanest area she could find. The contractions were coming every 5 minutes now, each one accompanied by the overwhelming urge to push that she was fighting with every ounce of willpower she possessed. Outside, the fire was getting closer. She could hear trees exploding in the heat, their sap superheated until the trunks burst like massive firecrackers. The windows of the cabin began to glow with an orange light that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Sarah lay on the sleeping bag and tried to remember everything she'd read about emergency childbirth. Stay calm, breathe through the contractions. Don't push until the cervix is fully dilated. But how was she supposed to know when that happened without medical equipment or even another person to help? The next contraction brought a sensation she couldn't ignore any longer. Her body was taking over, pushing whether she wanted it to or not. She could feel the first baby moving down, pressing against muscles that burned with the effort of stretching. Heat from the approaching fire was beginning to seep through the cabin walls. The temperature inside was rising, and Sarah could taste smoke in the air despite the closed windows. She stripped off her jeans and underwear, knowing instinctively that there was no time left for modesty or preparation. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. Through the growing roar of the Wildfire outside, Sarah heard something that made her freeze with a new kind of terror. The sound of burning embers hitting the cabin roof, followed by the unmistakable crackle of wood beginning to catch fire. The hunting lodge was burning around her, and she was about to give birth to twins with no help, no medical equipment, and no way to call for rescue, as another contraction seized her body with irresistible force. Sarah Mitchell realized that the next few hours would determine whether 3 lives would survive this nightmare, or whether the Colorado wilderness would claim them all. The first baby's head crowned just as flames began licking at the cabin's eastern wall. Sarah could see the tiny scalp covered in dark, wet hair between her trembling legs, and the sight filled her with a fierce determination that overrode her terror. This child was fighting to enter the world, and she would not let the fire claim either of them before that miracle happened. She bore down with the next contraction, her body working with an ancient wisdom that needed no instruction. The baby's head emerged fully, face down as nature intended, and Sarah reached with shaking hands to support the tiny skull. The skin was purple and slippery, impossibly delicate against her rough palms. "Come on, little one," she whispered through gritted teeth. "We're going to get through this." The shoulders came with the following contraction, first one, then the other, and suddenly the entire baby slid into Sarah's waiting hands in a rush of fluid and blood. The infant was small, but perfectly formed, with miniature fingers that immediately began grasping at the air, but the baby wasn't breathing. Panic shot through Sarah as she stared at the motionless form. The tiny chest wasn't rising, and the blue-purple skin wasn't pinking up as it should. She remembered reading about this in her pregnancy books. Sometimes babies needed help taking their first breath, especially premature ones. With trembling fingers, she cleared the baby's mouth and nose of mucus, then gently rubbed the narrow back. Still nothing. The cabin was filling with smoke now, making her own breathing labored, but she forced herself to stay focused. She placed her mouth over the baby's tiny nose and mouth and gave the gentlest puff of air she could manage. The effect was immediate. The infant's chest expanded, then contracted in a weak but unmistakable breath. Another breath followed, stronger this time, and the baby's skin began shifting from blue to pink. A thin, reedy cry filled the smoky air, the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. She wrapped the first baby in her spare shirt and placed the tiny bundle on her chest, skin to skin, trying to keep the infant warm while her body prepared for the second delivery. The reprieve was brief. Another contraction was already building, and she could feel the second baby moving into position. The heat inside the cabin was becoming unbearable. Sweat poured down Sarah's face, and each breath burned her throat. Through the windows, she could see walls of flame dancing just beyond the clearing. The fire had surrounded the lodge on 3 sides, and burning debris was raining down on the roof like hellish snow. She needed to move, but her body wasn't finished. The second baby was coming whether the building was burning or not. This delivery was faster, as if the first child had cleared the path for its sibling. Sarah felt the familiar pressure and stretching, the overwhelming urge to push that couldn't be denied. The baby's head appeared, then the shoulders, and within minutes she was holding a second perfect infant, slightly larger than the first, but just as startlingly small. This baby took its first breath without assistance, announcing its arrival, with a lusty wail that nearly drowned out the crackling flames. Sarah wrapped the second twin in her fleece jacket and cradled both babies against her chest, tears of relief streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. But relief was a luxury she couldn't afford. The cabin was now fully engulfed on the eastern side, and flames were beginning to spread across the ceiling. Sparks fell like rain around them, singeing her hair and clothes. The stone fireplace offered some protection, but she couldn't stay here much longer. Sarah struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from exhaustion and blood loss. Every movement sent waves of pain through her torn and battered body, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She had to get the babies to safety, but where could they go? The forest was an inferno, and she was in no condition to outrun the flames. The front door was already too hot to approach, the wood beginning to char and smoke. But there was a back entrance, a small door that led to what had once been a storage room. Sarah stumbled toward it, clutching both babies, praying it would open to reveal an escape route rather than more flames. The door opened to a small clearing behind the cabin where someone had once kept firewood. The space was still relatively clear of flames, protected by a rocky outcropping that rose from the forest floor like a natural barrier. But it was also a dead end. The rocks were too steep to climb, especially in her weakened condition, and the forest beyond was already burning. Sarah sank onto a fallen log at the base of the rocks, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. The babies were crying now, thin, mewling sounds that broke her heart. They were cold, hungry, and probably going into shock from the traumatic birth. She needed to get them warm, needed to feed them, needed medical attention for all three of them, but most urgently, she needed to get them away from the fire that was consuming their temporary shelter. The main cabin was fully engulfed now, flames shooting through the roof and sending sparks high into the smoky sky. The heat was intense even at this distance, and Sarah could feel her hair beginning to singe. She pressed the babies closer to her body, trying to shield them from the radiant heat while searching desperately for any sign of escape. That's when she saw the cave. It was little more than a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely visible behind. A curtain of tangled vines and debris. Sarah might have missed it entirely if not for the faint current of cooler air flowing from the opening. She crawled toward it, dragging herself across the rocky ground while protecting the babies with her body. The entrance was tight, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it opened into a larger chamber beyond. Sarah squeezed through the gap, ignoring the sharp stones that scraped her skin, and found herself in a natural cave that extended deep into the mountainside. The air inside was cool and clean, untainted by smoke. Water dripped steadily from stalactites overhead, creating small pools on the cave floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe from the fire, and that was all that mattered. Sarah collapsed against the cave wall and examined her babies in the dim light. Both were breathing steadily now, their skin a healthy pink color despite their small size. The first baby, who she mentally dubbed One, seemed slightly more fragile, with translucent skin and delicate features. The second, Two, was more robust, with a stronger cry and more active movements. She needed to keep them warm and try to nurse them, though she wasn't sure if her milk had come in yet. Premature babies often had trouble latching, but she had to try. Their survival depended on getting nutrition and warmth. One latched immediately, tiny mouth working instinctively at her breast. The sensation was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, simultaneously painful and deeply satisfying. Two took longer to figure out the process, but eventually began nursing as well, alternating with the sibling in a natural rhythm that amazed her. Outside the cave, the fire raged with increasing intensity. Sarah could hear massive trees falling, their crashes echoing through the mountain valleys like thunder. The air glowed orange through the cave entrance, and the heat was still noticeable even in their stone sanctuary. But for the moment, they were safe. The babies were feeding, their tiny bodies warming against hers. Sarah allowed herself to rest, though she knew their ordeal was far from over. The fire would eventually burn itself out, but that could take hours or even days. She had no food, no water except what dripped from the cave ceiling, and no way to contact the outside world. Worse, she was bleeding more heavily than seemed normal after childbirth. The cave floor beneath her was stained with dark patches, and she could feel warmth continuing to seep from her body. She needed medical attention soon, or she might not survive to care for the babies she'd fought so hard to bring into the world. The sound that woke her was so faint she almost missed it over the roar of flames outside. A rhythmic thumping, like footsteps moving carefully across rocky ground. Sarah's eyes snapped open, every maternal instinct suddenly alert. Animals fleeing the fire might seek shelter in the cave, and she was in no condition to defend herself or the babies. The footsteps paused just outside the cave entrance. Sarah held her breath, pressing the sleeping babies closer to her chest. Through the narrow opening, she could see a shadow moving against the orange glow of the fires. Then a voice called out, barely audible over the crackling flames, "Hello! Is someone in there?" It was a man's voice, deep and rough with smoke inhalation. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She was completely vulnerable, half naked and weak from blood loss, with two helpless infants depending on her protection. But what choice did she have? If this person meant harm, she couldn't fight them off. If they meant help, she desperately needed it. "Yes," she called back, her voice cracking from thirst and smoke. "I'm here. I have babies." The shadow at the cave entrance moved closer, and Sarah got her first glimpse of her unexpected visitor. He was tall and lean, with shoulder-length dark hair and a beard that had been singed by the flames. His clothes were burned and torn, and soot covered his face like war paint. But his eyes, when they met hers in the dim cave light, were gentle and concerned. "My God," he breathed, taking in the scene before him. "Are you hurt? How did you get here?" Sarah tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the movement. "I was in labor when the fire started. I had to take shelter here. The babies, they were born about an hour ago." The man dropped to his knees beside her, his expression shifting from surprise to professional concern. "I'm Marcus Thompson. I live up the mountain from here. Are you bleeding badly? Do the babies seem healthy?" "I think I'm bleeding too much," Sarah admitted, relief flooding through her at finding someone who seemed to know what they were doing. "The babies are breathing and nursing, but they're so small. They weren't supposed to come for another month." Marcus shrugged off his pack and pulled out what looked like a well-stocked first aid kit. "I'm a retired paramedic," he explained, as if reading her thoughts. "I moved up here after my wife died, but old habits die hard. I always carry medical supplies. When I'm hiking." He worked quickly but gently, assessing her condition with practiced hands. The bleeding was concerning, but not immediately life-threatening, he assured her. The babies appeared healthy despite their early arrival, though they would need to be kept warm and fed regularly. "The fire's moving north," Marcus told her as he worked. "It'll be hours before it's safe to travel, but I know a way out that doesn't go through the worst of it. There's an old mining road that connects to the highway about 5 miles from here. My truck is parked at the trailhead." "Why were you out in this?" Sarah asked, studying his soot-covered face. Marcus paused in his work, and Sarah saw something flicker across his expression. Pain, perhaps, or guilt. "I was trying to save my cabin. Spent 10 years building it after I retired, but the fire moved faster than I expected, and I had to run for it." He shook his head. "Guess some things aren't meant to be saved." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "Don't be finding you and these babies. Maybe this is why I was supposed to be out here tonight." He finished bandaging the worst of her tears and sat back on his heels. "What are their names?" Sarah realized she hadn't thought about names at all. The babies had arrived too quickly, too dramatically for such normal considerations. "I don't know yet. Everything happened so fast." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his harsh features. "Well, they're fighters, that's for sure. Not many babies get born in the middle of a wildfire and come out this strong." One of the babies began to fuss, and Sarah adjusted her position to nurse again. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. The babies needed food more than she needed comfort. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain, and partly because she was curious about this mysterious man who'd appeared like an angel in the darkness. 3 years, Marcus replied, checking his supplies. After my wife Sarah died, cancer, I couldn't stand the city anymore. Too many memories, so I bought some land up here and built a place where I could think and maybe find some peace. Your wife was named Sarah too? He nodded, his eyes growing distant. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson. Prettiest nurse in Denver General, at least according to me. We were married 32 years when she passed. The coincidence sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cool cave air. That's my name, Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something like recognition flicker in his eyes. But before either of them could comment on the strange coincidence, a new sound reached them from outside the cave, the unmistakable whine of helicopter rotors cutting through the smoky air. "Search and rescue," Marcus said, scrambling to his feet. "Someone must have reported the fire spreading faster than expected. They'll be looking for people who might be trapped." He moved toward the cave entrance, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait, what if they can't see us? What if they don't know we're here?" Marcus pulled a small mirror from his pack and angled it to catch the firelight from outside. Standard signaling technique. The reflection will be visible from the air, even through the smoke. The helicopter sound grew louder, and soon they could see searchlights cutting through the orange-tinted darkness. Marcus worked the mirror steadily, sending flashes of light up toward the aircraft. The helicopter made 2 passes before the searchlights swung in their direction, illuminating the rocky outcropping and the smoldering remains of the hunting lodge. The aircraft hovered overhead for several minutes, and Sarah could see figures moving in the open doorway. "They see us," Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. "They're looking for a place to land." But as they watched, the helicopter began to pull away, rising higher into the smoky sky. Sarah's heart sank. Had they decided the area was too dangerous? Were they going to leave them stranded after all? Then she heard Marcus laugh, a sound of pure relief. "They're not leaving. Look." A rope was descending from the hovering aircraft, and a figure in rescue gear was rappelling down through the smoke-filled air. Help was finally coming, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that had brought her and Marcus together, in circumstances too extraordinary to be mere coincidence. The rescue medic who descended from the helicopter was a woman in her 40s, with short blonde hair and intense blue eyes that took in the situation with professional calm. She landed gracefully despite the swirling smoke and immediately began assessing the scene while speaking into her radio headset. "Base, this is Rebecca Chen. I've got 1 adult female postpartum with twin newborns. All 3 are conscious and breathing. The mother appears to have significant blood loss, and the infants are premature. I need immediate medical transport to Denver General's NICU." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Denver General, that was where she'd planned to deliver, where her own obstetrician had privileges. These people knew what they were doing. Rebecca moved into the cave with practiced efficiency, her medical bag already open. "I'm Rebecca, and you're going to be fine. Can you tell me your name and how long ago the babies were born?" "Sarah Mitchell. They were born maybe 2 hours ago, I'm not sure exactly. Everything's been a blur since the contractions started." "That's completely understandable." Rebecca began checking Sarah's vital signs while simultaneously examining the twins. "These little ones look remarkably good for what they've been through. You did an incredible job under impossible circumstances." Marcus stepped forward. "I'm Marcus Thompson, a retired paramedic. I found her about an hour ago and provided basic first aid. The bleeding seems to have slowed, but she's lost a significant amount." Rebecca nodded in acknowledgement. "Good work, keeping them warm and stable. Sarah, I need to ask, is there anyone we should contact? Family who should know you're safe?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. David. Her husband had no idea what had happened. He was probably at home in Denver, maybe worried that she hadn't called, but certainly not imagining that she'd given birth alone in a wildfire. The argument they'd had before she left seemed incredibly petty now. My husband, David Mitchell. His number is in my phone, but I don't know where it is. It might be in my car, but that's miles from here. Don't worry about that now. We'll sort out the details once we get you to the hospital. Rebecca was preparing what looked like an IV line. I'm going to give you some fluids and something for the pain. Then we need to get you and the babies up to the helicopter. The process of preparing for evacuation was more complex than Sarah had imagined. Rebecca used a special harness system designed for medical evacuations, securing both babies against Sarah's chest in a way that would protect them during the ascent while allowing her to maintain skin-to-skin contact. Marcus watched the preparations with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. There was relief there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like loss. When Rebecca began explaining how the rescue would proceed, he took a step back as if preparing to fade into the background. "Wait," Sarah said, reaching out to catch his arm. "You're coming with us, right?" Marcus shook his head. "The helicopter can only take so much weight, especially in these conditions. You and the babies need all the medical equipment they can carry. But your cabin burned down. You have nowhere to go." "I'll be fine. I know these mountains better than anyone. There are other shelters, other ways out." He squeezed her hand gently. "Getting you three to safety is what matters now." Rebecca looked up from her preparations. "Actually, there might be room. We've got a bigger bird coming in for a second run. They're evacuating some campers who got trapped on the North Ridge. Marcus, if you want transport out, we can make it work." Sarah saw something shift in Marcus's expression, a momentary uncertainty that surprised her. For a man who seemed so comfortable in the wilderness, he looked almost afraid of returning to civilization. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I came up here to get away from everything. I'm not sure I'm ready to go back." "You don't have to go back to the same life," Sarah said, understanding something in his hesitation, "but you could start a new one. Maybe somewhere you could help people again, the way you helped us tonight." The conversation was interrupted by the whine of the helicopter's winch system engaging. Rebecca had finished her preparations and was ready to begin the evacuation. The babies were secure against Sarah's chest, and she was strapped into the rescue harness with multiple safety lines. The ascent through the smoke-filled air was terrifying and surreal. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on the feeling of her babies breathing against her chest, their tiny hearts beating steadily despite everything they'd endured. Below them, the forest continued to burn, painting the night sky in shades of orange and red that looked like the end of the world. Inside, the helicopter, the noise was overwhelming, but the medical team worked with choreographed precision. Rebecca continued monitoring Sarah's condition, while a second medic, a young man named Jake, began setting up incubators for the twins. "We need to separate them for the flight," Rebecca explained, raising her voice over the engine noise. "It's safer for transport, and we can monitor them better individually." Sarah's arms felt empty and cold, without the babies pressed against her skin, but she could see them in their respective incubators, still breathing, still fighting. Tiny IV lines snaked into their impossibly small hands, and monitoring equipment tracked their vital signs with reassuring beeps and chirps. The flight to Denver General took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, exhaustion, and blood loss, finally taking their toll now that the immediate crisis was over. When she was awake, she watched the incubators and listened to Rebecca's steady updates to the hospital. "We've got twin males, approximately 34 weeks gestation, born under extreme circumstances. Birth weights appear to be around 4 pounds each. Mother is stable but has lost significant blood. ETA 12 minutes. Twin males. Sons." The reality of it hit Sarah with surprising force. She was a mother now, not in some theoretical future sense, but right now, immediately and irrevocably. Two tiny people depended on her completely, and she had no idea how to process that responsibility. The hospital landing pad was a blur of activity. Sarah was transferred to a gurney and wheeled rapidly through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, so different from the pine and smoke scents that had defined her world for the past few hours. The twins disappeared in different directions, each accompanied by a team of NICU specialists. In the delivery room, because that's what this was, really, a continuation of the birth process that had begun in the burning cabin, Sarah was finally able to receive proper medical care. Dr. Patterson, her obstetrician, had been called in despite the late hour and examined her with gentle thoroughness. "Remarkable," she kept saying as she worked. "Absolutely remarkable. The placenta's delivered cleanly. The tears are relatively minor considering the circumstances, and the babies appear to be in excellent condition for their gestational age." "They're going to be okay?" Sarah asked, the question she'd been afraid to voice finally escaping. "They're going to be fine. Premature, yes, and they'll need to stay in the NICU for a few weeks, but all their vital signs are strong. You did something extraordinary tonight, Sarah. Most women wouldn't have been able to handle what you went through." A nurse appeared at Sarah's bedside with a phone. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband is on the line. He's been trying to reach you since yesterday evening." David's voice was tight with panic when she took the phone. "Sarah? Jesus Christ, where have you been? I've been calling and calling, and then the police called and said there was a wildfire in the area where you went. I've been imagining—" "David, I'm okay. We're all okay." "We? What do you mean, we?" Sarah took a deep breath, hardly believing the words herself. "The babies came early. I gave birth to twin boys about 6 hours ago. They're in the NICU, but they're healthy." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You gave birth? Alone? In a wildfire? It's a long story. I'll tell you everything when you get here, but David, they're beautiful. They're perfect." He was crying now, she could hear it in his voice. "I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry about the fight. I should have been there with you. You couldn't have known this would happen. No one could have. Just come meet your sons." After she hung up, Sarah lay back in the hospital bed and tried to process everything that had happened. Less than 12 hours ago, she'd been a pregnant woman on a simple retreat. Now she was a mother of twins, a survivor of circumstances so extraordinary they seemed like fiction. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus Thompson stood in the doorway, looking strange and out of place in the sterile hospital environment. He'd cleaned up somewhat, though his clothes were still singed and smoky, and someone had bandaged burns on his hands that Sarah hadn't noticed in the cave. "I wanted to make sure you were all right before I left," he said quietly. "The doctors said the boys are doing well. You came to the hospital. I thought you weren't ready to return to civilization." Marcus smiled, and Sarah saw something different in his expression, lighter perhaps, or more hopeful. "Someone told me I might be able to start a new life instead of going back to an old one. I've been thinking about that. And the hospital here has an opening for a paramedic instructor, teaching new recruits, sharing experience with younger medics. Rebecca mentioned it during the flight." He paused, looking uncertain. "I haven't worked in a hospital since Sarah died. But tonight, helping you and the babies, it reminded me why I became a paramedic in the first place." Sarah felt a strange sense of completion, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "What was your wife's middle name?" she asked suddenly. Marcus looked surprised by the question. "Elizabeth. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson. Why?" "My middle name is Elizabeth too. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell." She watched his face as understanding dawned. "Do you think that's just coincidence?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him, working through the implications. Two Sarahs, both with the middle name Elizabeth, a retired paramedic who'd lost his wife finding a pregnant woman in labor during a wildfire. The timing, the circumstances, the way everything had aligned to save 3 lives. I stopped believing in coincidences the night my wife died, Marcus said finally. She always said that when people needed help, the universe found a way to provide. Maybe she was right. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband is here, and the babies are stable enough for a brief visit if you'd like to see them. Sarah looked at Marcus, suddenly not wanting him to disappear from their lives as unexpectedly as he'd entered them. Will you stay? I'd like David to meet you. I'd like the boys to know the man who helped bring them safely into the world. Marcus nodded, and Sarah saw that he'd made his decision about more than just the job opportunity. I'd like that very much. As they prepared to visit the NICU, Sarah realized that the fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead forged connections that might never have existed otherwise. 3 lives had been saved, but perhaps more importantly, new purposes had been discovered, new paths had opened, and the possibility of healing had emerged from the ashes of loss. The twins were sleeping peacefully in their incubators, tiny chests, rising and falling with the rhythm of new life. They were fighters, these boys, born in fire and flame, but emerging strong and whole. As Sarah watched them breathe, she knew that whatever names she chose for them would have to reflect their extraordinary beginning and the hope that had emerged from impossible circumstances. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but no longer frightening. She was no longer the same woman who had driven up to a mountain cabin seeking solitude. She was a mother now, connected to these 2 small lives and to the mysterious man who had appeared when they needed him most. The fire had taken much, but it had also given them something precious, a story of survival, connection, and the kind of hope that only emerges from the darkest moments. David Mitchell burst through the NICU doors like a man possessed, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it during the frantic drive from their apartment. He'd thrown on whatever clothes he could find, mismatched socks, an inside-out sweater, and jeans with paint stains from their weekend home improvement projects that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. When he saw Sarah sitting in the wheelchair beside 2 isolettes, his face crumpled with relief and something deeper, a raw vulnerability that made him look younger than his 34 years. The twins were so small they seemed almost mythical, like fairy tale creatures made of porcelain and hope. "They're real," he whispered, approaching the incubators with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. "They're actually here." Sarah watched her husband's face transform as he studied their sons. The anger and fear that had marked their last conversation evaporated, replaced by wonder so pure it made her chest ache. This was the David she'd fallen in love with, the man who cried at movies and spent hours researching the best car seats, even though the babies weren't due for another month. "This one came first," she said, pointing to the isolette on the left. "He's a little smaller, but he was the brave one. He led the way for his brother. And this fighter here," Marcus added, indicating the second baby, "came out ready to take on the world." Loudest cry I've ever heard from someone so tiny. David looked up then, seeming to notice Marcus for the first time. Sarah watched uncertainty flicker across her husband's features as he took in the older man's burned clothes and smoke-darkened face. "David, this is Marcus Thompson," Sarah said quickly. "He's the one who found us in the cave. He's a retired paramedic, and he saved our lives." David straightened, extending his hand with the formal politeness he reserved for important business meetings. "I don't know how to thank you. Sarah told me what you did, but I can't even imagine—" "You don't need to thank me," Marcus interrupted, gently. "Finding them was the most important thing I've done in years. They gave me something too." Before David could ask what he meant, Dr. Patterson appeared with a team of nurses. The NICU visiting hours were strict, even for parents, and Sarah needed to return to her room for continued monitoring. But as they prepared to leave, one of the babies, the smaller one, opened his eyes for the first time. The eyes that looked up at them were dark blue, almost navy, with an alertness that seemed impossible for someone who'd entered the world just hours ago. He seemed to study each face, hovering over his isolette with serious concentration, as if memorizing them for future reference. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, pressing her palm against the isolette's clear wall. "We're your family." The baby's tiny fist uncurled, fingers stretching toward her voice as if he could reach through the barriers between them. David made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and even Marcus wiped at his eyes with the back of his bandaged hand. Over the next week, the NICU became their second home. David had taken indefinite leave from his marketing firm, setting up a makeshift office in the family waiting room where he could work between feeding times and medical updates. Sarah spent every allowed moment beside the isolettes, learning to change diapers the size of tea saucers and bottle-feed babies whose stomachs were smaller than ping-pong balls. Marcus visited daily, always arriving with coffee for David and flowers for Sarah that he claimed came from the hospital gift shop, but which Sarah suspected came from much more thoughtful sources. He'd taken the instructor position at Denver General and was already working with the rescue teams, sharing hard-won experience with younger paramedics who listened to his stories with rapt attention. "He's different here than he was on the mountain," Sarah observed to David one afternoon as they watched Marcus demonstrate proper infant CPR techniques to a group of nursing students. "More settled, like he's found his place again." David nodded, though Sarah caught something complicated in his expression. "He's been incredibly helpful, maybe too helpful." "What do you mean?" "Nothing, just—" David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He knows more about the boy's medical needs than I do. He remembers things the doctors said that I completely missed. Sometimes I feel like he's more their parent than I am." Sarah understood then. Her husband wasn't threatened by Marcus's presence. He was grateful for it. But gratitude could be its own burden, especially when it highlighted your own feelings of inadequacy. David had missed the most dramatic moment of his children's lives, and no amount of present dedication could change that fact. "You're their father," she said firmly. "Nothing that happened that night changes that. Marcus helped bring them into the world, but you're going to help them grow up in it." The naming discussion had been ongoing for days. Every suggestion felt either too ordinary for children with such extraordinary beginnings or too dramatic for babies who would need to live normal lives. Sarah had filled 3 notebooks with possibilities, crossing out names as quickly as she wrote them down. It was Marcus who finally provided the solution, though he did it indirectly. "My grandfather was a fire lookout," he mentioned during one of their bedside conversations. "Spent 40 years watching over these mountains, warning people when danger was coming. His name was Jasper, and folks used to say he could smell smoke from 50 miles away." "Jasper," Sarah repeated, testing the sound. "Jasper Mitchell." She looked at the smaller twin, the one who'd come first, who'd led the way through danger for his brother. The name felt right in a way that surprised her with its certainty. "And his brother?" David asked, following her train of thought. This time it was the NICU nurse, an elderly woman named Helen, who provided inspiration. "In 30 years of working with preemies, I've never seen twins look out for each other the way these two do. When one's heart rate drops, the other gets agitated. When we moved their isolettes closer together, both their stats improved. It's like they're still connected, still protecting each other. Like guardian angels," Sarah murmured, watching the second twin's hand press against the isolette wall, fingers stretched toward his brother's matching gesture. "Like Gabriel and Jasper Mitchell. The names felt like gifts, perfectly." suited to boys who'd survived impossible circumstances and emerged stronger for them. The twins were 3 weeks old when the first complication arose. Gabriel developed a respiratory infection that, while not uncommon in premature infants, was serious enough to require intensive intervention. Sarah watched helplessly as her larger, stronger son was intubated and placed on a ventilator, his tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. "This is normal," Dr. Patterson assured them during the crisis meeting in her office. "Preemies' immune systems are still developing. We caught it early, and Gabriel is responding well to treatment." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening. Jasper, separated from his brother for the first time since birth, became increasingly restless. His feeding declined, his sleep patterns disrupted, and the nurses reported that he cried inconsolably whenever Gabriel's alarm sounded. "They need to be together," she told David one evening as they sat in the darkened NICU, each beside a different isolette. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think Jasper is getting sick because Gabriel is sick." "That's not how infections work, Sarah," Dr. Patterson explained. "I'm not talking about medical causation. I'm talking about something else, something the medical books don't cover." Marcus, who'd been quietly reading in the corner, looked up from his magazine. "Twin telepathy," he said matter-of-factly. "My partner when I was active duty, Rodriguez, had twin daughters, swore up and down that when one got hurt, the other felt it. Medical community calls it coincidence, but Rodriguez documented it for years." David looked skeptical, but Sarah felt validation flood through her. "What did Rodriguez do about it?" "Convinced the hospital to let them share an isolette whenever possible. Said it made both babies stronger." Marcus closed his magazine and approached Gabriel's bedside. Of course, that was 20 years ago. Medical protocols might be different. Now, the conversation that followed with Dr. Patterson was delicate. The physician was sympathetic, but firm about infection control protocols. However, she agreed to consult with the NICU team about modified co-bedding arrangements once Gabriel's acute phase passed. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had fallen asleep in the reclining chair beside Jasper's isolette when an alarm woke her. But instead of the harsh beeping that usually signaled distress, this was a different tone, the alert that indicated improved status. Gabriel was breathing on his own again. The ventilator had been removed and he was maintaining oxygen saturation, levels without mechanical assistance. More remarkably, his infection markers had dropped dramatically overnight, a recovery speed that surprised even the experienced NICU staff. And Jasper, for the first time in days, was sleeping peacefully. "It's like they knew," the night nurse Patricia told Sarah as they watched both babies sleep. The minute Gabriel turned the corner, Jasper settled right down. "I've seen a lot of things in this unit, but I've never seen anything quite like this." Dr. Patterson approved co-bedding the following week. The first time the twins were placed together in a single isolette, both their vital signs stabilized immediately. Gabriel's breathing became deeper and more regular, while Jasper's feeding improved dramatically. They positioned themselves instinctively. Jasper's smaller form curved protectively around his brother, tiny hands touching, as if to confirm the other's presence. "They're going to be okay," Sarah whispered to David as they watched their sons sleep together for the first time since birth. "Really okay." But even as relief washed over her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. The boys were strong now, healthy and growing, but they carried something extraordinary in their shared experience. They'd survived fire and separation, fought their way into the world under impossible circumstances, and found their way back to each other against medical odds. Marcus seemed to sense her thoughts. "They're going to be special, these boys," he said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, not just because of how they were born, but because of what they represent. Hope emerging from chaos, strength found in the darkest moments. Sometimes I wonder if that night was real, Sarah admitted. It feels like a dream now, or a story someone told me about someone else's life. It was real, Marcus assured her. And it changed all of us. You became a mother under fire, literally. David became a father to miracle babies. And He paused, watching the twins sleep. I remembered why my life mattered again. The day they finally brought Gabriel and Jasper home was crystalline clear, with the kind of Colorado sunshine that made everything look newly washed. The twins, now 8 weeks old and weighing over 6 pounds each, traveled in matching car seats that David had researched obsessively and practiced installing dozens of times. As they drove through Denver toward their apartment, Sarah caught sight of the mountains in her rearview mirror. Somewhere up there, in a forest that was already beginning to regenerate from the fire, was a cave where 2 lives had begun against impossible odds. Somewhere up there was a burned cabin where she'd made the choice to fight rather than surrender. She would tell the boys this story someday when they were old enough to understand. She would tell them about the fire that brought them into the world, about the man who appeared through the flames to help them, about the love that connected them even before birth and sustained them through every challenge that followed. But for now, it was enough to watch them sleep in their car seats. Jasper's tiny fist still reaching toward his brother, Gabriel's face turned toward the sound of his twins' breathing. They were home, they were safe, and they were exactly where they belonged, together, surrounded by the family that had fought for them from their very first breath. The first year of Gabriel and Jasper's life unfolded like a series of small miracles wrapped in sleepless nights and endless laundry. Sarah discovered that motherhood was simultaneously more exhausting and more exhilarating than anything she'd imagined, particularly with twins who seemed to operate on opposite schedules designed to ensure she never slept for more than 2 hours at a time. But there were signs early on that these weren't ordinary children. The pediatrician, Dr. Amanda Foster, first noticed it during their 6-month checkup. While examining Jasper, she accidentally pricked his heel with the blood draw needle harder than usual. Before Jasper could even begin to cry, Gabriel, lying on the examination table 3 feet away, let out a sharp wail of distress, his small body arching as if he'd been the one hurt. "That's unusual," Dr. Foster murmured, making a note in their chart. "Has anything like this happened before?" Sarah exchanged a glance with David, who was holding Gabriel and trying to soothe his inexplicable tears. They'd noticed things. Small moments when one twin seemed to anticipate the other's needs, times when they moved in perfect synchronization, despite being too young for deliberate coordination. But they'd attributed it to normal twin behavior. "They've always been very connected," Sarah said carefully. "Even in the NICU, the nurses commented on how they seemed to sense each other's moods." Dr. Foster completed her examination with increased attention to detail, testing reflexes and responses with the kind of scientific curiosity that made Sarah slightly nervous. When she finished, she sat back and studied both babies with an expression that mixed professional fascination with something approaching bewilderment. "Their physical development is exceptional," she announced. "Both boys are meeting milestones ahead of schedule, which is remarkable given their premature birth and traumatic entry into the world. But there's something else." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been a pediatrician for 15 years, and I've treated dozens of twin sets. What I'm observing here goes beyond typical twin bonding. Have you considered having them evaluated by a child development specialist?" That night, after the boys were finally asleep in their shared crib, they refused to sleep separately, becoming agitated whenever placed in different rooms. Sarah and David discussed Dr. Foster's recommendation over cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Maybe we should call Marcus," David suggested, surprising Sarah with the suggestion. Her husband's initial jealousy regarding Marcus's role in their sons' lives had evolved into genuine friendship over the months, particularly after Marcus had helped David through a panic attack during one of Gabriel's minor fevers. "You think he'd have insight into this? He worked in emergency medicine for 30 years. He's seen things that don't make it into textbooks." David reached across the table to take her hand. "Besides, he knows their story better than anyone. Except us. If something unusual is happening, he deserves to know." Marcus arrived the next evening with a grocery bag full of ingredients for his famous chili, a recipe he'd learned from his late wife Sarah and had started making for their family every Friday night. It had become a tradition that anchored their week, providing stability in the controlled chaos of raising infant twins. "Dr. Foster thinks they might have some kind of enhanced connection," Sarah explained, as Marcus stirred the pot and listened with the focused attention he brought to all medical discussions. Beyond normal twin behavior, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I've been wondering about that myself. Last week, when Gabriel had that diaper rash, Jasper kept grabbing at his own bottom even though his skin was perfectly clear. And remember when Jasper bumped his head on the coffee table? Gabriel was the one who cried." "You've been watching this?" David asked. "In my line of work, you learn to pay attention to things that don't fit standard patterns. These boys—" Marcus ladled chili into bowls and joined them at the kitchen table. They were born under circumstances that would challenge any scientific explanation. Maybe those circumstances left them with something science can't easily categorize. The conversation was interrupted by crying from the nursery, not the hungry wail they'd grown accustomed to, but something sharper and more distressed. Sarah hurried to check on them, expecting to find one of the boys tangled in blankets or startled by a bad dream. Instead, she found both twins sitting up in their crib, wide awake and perfectly calm, staring intently at the nursery window. Following their gaze, Sarah saw what had captured their attention: a small fire truck, its lights flashing silently as it responded to some distant emergency, passing on the street below their second-floor apartment. "The fire truck woke them?" David asked, joining her at the window, but Sarah noticed something that made her skin prickle with recognition. The boys weren't looking at the truck with the casual interest typical of children drawn to bright lights. They were watching it with the kind of focused intensity she'd seen in their eyes during medical procedures, as if they understood something about fire and emergency response that went beyond their developmental capabilities. "Marcus!" she called, not taking her eyes off the twins. "You need to see this." Marcus appeared in the doorway and immediately understood what had captured their attention. His expression grew serious as he observed the boys' behavior, noting the way they tracked the fire truck's progress with synchronized head movements, the way they remained alert and engaged long after the vehicle had disappeared from view. "How often do they react to emergency vehicles like this?" he asked quietly. "I never noticed before," Sarah admitted, "but now that you mention it—" Over the following weeks, they began paying closer attention to the twins' responses to their environment. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and unsettling. Gabriel and Jasper seemed particularly attuned to situations involving distress or emergency. They would wake from deep sleep when ambulances passed, become agitated during news reports about natural disasters, and show remarkable calm during medical appointments that typically distressed other children their age. Dr. Foster's recommendation led them to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist who specialized in exceptional development patterns. Dr. Rodriguez had heard their birth story through the medical community grapevine and was intrigued enough to agree to an evaluation despite the boy's young age. Traumatic birth experiences can sometimes result in heightened sensitivity to environmental stresses, she explained during their first consultation. But what you're describing suggests something more complex, almost like they developed enhanced empathetic responses as a survival mechanism. The evaluation process involved hours of observation, play therapy sessions, and standardized tests adapted for infant subjects. Dr. Rodriguez documented behaviors that reinforced their parents' observations. The boys consistently responded to each other's distress before showing their own, demonstrated problem-solving abilities ahead of their developmental timeline, and showed remarkable resilience during stressful situations. Their neural pathways may have developed differently due to the extreme circumstances of their birth, Dr. Rodriguez concluded. Shared trauma, combined with their genetic predisposition as identical twins, could have created enhanced connectivity, not just between them, but with environmental stresses in general. "Is this something we should be concerned about?" Sarah asked, voicing the worry that had been growing in her mind. "Will it affect their ability to have normal lives?" "That depends on how we define normal," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "These boys may grow up with capabilities that set them apart from their peers, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be disadvantaged. With proper guidance, enhanced empathy, and environmental awareness could become significant strengths." The first real test of this theory came when Gabriel and Jasper were 14 months old. Sarah was pushing them in their double stroller through Washington Park when she noticed unusual agitation from both boys. They were pointing repeatedly toward a cluster of trees near the pond, babbling with urgent tones that suggested they were trying to communicate something important. "What is it, guys?" Sarah asked, following their pointing fingers toward the trees. "What do you see?" At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the typical park scene of joggers, dog walkers, and families, enjoying the spring afternoon. But the boys' agitation continued to escalate, their pointing becoming more insistent, their vocalizations more distressed. Then she heard it. A thin, high-pitched crying coming from the direction they were indicating. Sarah pushed the stroller off the path and toward the sound, following the twins' guidance through the trees until she discovered its source. A small child, maybe 3 years old, was sitting alone beside the pond, tears streaming down his face as he clutched a soggy, stuffed animal. "Where's your mommy, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the little boy while keeping one eye on her own children, who had immediately calmed once she'd found the source of distress. The boy pointed toward the crowded playground on the far side of the park. Sarah could see adults searching frantically, calling a name that sounded like Tommy or Timmy. She gathered the lost child and her twins, making her way across the park to reunite the family, while marveling at how Gabriel and Jasper had somehow known to alert her to the situation. "They led you right to him," the grateful mother said, when Sarah explained how she'd found her son. "How did they know he was there?" Sarah looked down at her boys, now contentedly sharing a snack in their stroller, and realized she had no answer that would make sense to a stranger. How could she explain that her 14-month-old twins seemed to have some kind of early warning system for distress situations? That evening, she called Marcus to tell him about the park incident. His response surprised her with its lack of surprise. "I've been expecting something like this," he admitted. "Sarah, I need to tell you something I probably should have mentioned. Months ago, there have been other situations, small things, where the boys seemed to sense problems before anyone else noticed them." "What kind of situations?" "Remember when Mrs. Chen from next door fell in her kitchen last month? Gabriel and Jasper started crying at the exact moment it happened, even though you were 3 floors away and couldn't have heard anything. And the day your building's fire alarm malfunctioned, they were fussy and restless for hours before it went off." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She'd attributed both incidents to typical infant behavior, but viewed through this new lens, it took on different significance. "Marcus, what are you saying? That they have some kind of supernatural ability?" I'm saying they were born under extraordinary circumstances that may have left them with extraordinary capabilities. As a paramedic, I learned to trust intuition that couldn't be scientifically explained. Sometimes people just know things they shouldn't be able to know. The conversation haunted Sarah for days. She found herself watching the boys more closely, noting their reactions to situations she might previously have overlooked. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Gabriel and Jasper possessed an uncanny ability to sense distress, danger, or need in their environment. David's response to this revelation was typically practical. If they really do have some kind of enhanced awareness, we need to understand how to help them manage it. Imagine growing up feeling everyone else's pain and fear. That could be overwhelming. They returned to Dr. Rodriguez with their new observations. The psychologist listened with growing fascination, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about timing, circumstances, and the twins' specific responses. What you're describing aligns with documented cases of enhanced empathetic abilities in children who've experienced early trauma, she said. The medical literature contains scattered reports of similar phenomena, though it's rarely studied systematically because it's so difficult to quantify. So this is real. It's not just our imagination. Based on your documentation and my observations, yes, I believe your sons have developed heightened sensitivity to environmental distress signals. The question now is how to help them learn to manage these abilities as they grow older. Dr. Rodriguez recommended a specialized program designed for children with exceptional empathetic abilities, a small but growing field within child psychology. The program focused on teaching children how to distinguish between their own emotions and those they were sensing from others, how to protect themselves from emotional overload, and how to use their abilities constructively rather than being overwhelmed by them. As Gabriel and Jasper approached their second birthday, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The fire that had threatened to destroy everything had instead created something unprecedented. Two small boys who carried within them an extraordinary capacity for connection and compassion. They're going to change the world, Marcus said one Friday evening as they watched the twins play together with an intuitive cooperation that still amazed the adults around them. Not in some grand dramatic way, but in small important moments when they help people who need it most. Sarah nodded, understanding finally why their story had unfolded the way it had. The fire hadn't been a disaster to survive. It had been a forge where something remarkable was being created. Gabriel and Jasper weren't just survivors of extraordinary circumstances. They were the living embodiment of hope emerging from chaos, of connection triumphing over separation, of love finding a way to flourish even in the darkest moments. Their story was far from over. In fact, as she watched her sons share a wordless communication that needed no translation, Sarah realized it was just beginning. The boys who had been born in fire were growing into young men who might help heal a world that desperately needed their particular gifts. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities that none of them could fully imagine, but all of them were eager to discover. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, when Gabriel and Jasper were 3 years old. Sarah jolted awake to the shrill ring, her heart immediately racing with the parental terror that all middle-of-the-night calls brought. But before she could even reach for the phone, she heard it, both boys crying in unison from their bedroom down the hall. "Mitchell residence," David answered groggily, while Sarah rushed to check on the twins. She found Gabriel and Jasper standing in their shared bed, arms wrapped around each other, tears streaming down their faces as they stared toward the window that faced east, toward the mountains where their story had begun. "Mama," Jasper whispered, the word barely audible through his sobs. "Fire hurt." "Big fire?" Gabriel added, his small body trembling against his brother's. People are scared. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She scooped both boys into her arms just as David appeared in the doorway, his face pale in the hallway light. That was the emergency dispatch coordinator, he said quietly. There's a massive wildfire in Boulder County. Started about an hour ago, and it's moving fast. They're evacuating the entire mountain corridor. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Boulder County, that was where her grandfather's cabin had been, where the old hunting lodge still stood as a monument to that terrifying night 3 years ago. The place where Gabriel and Jasper had first entered the world was burning again, but more unsettling was the timing. The boys had awakened and begun crying before the phone rang, before anyone in Denver knew about the fire. Somehow, across 50 miles of distance, they had sensed the flames and the fear of people in danger. "We need to call Marcus," Sarah said, settling the twins on the couch in the living room. They clung to each other with desperate intensity, their usual chatter replaced by whispered words in the private language they'd developed, a mixture of English and sounds only they understood. Marcus arrived within 20 minutes, still in the clothes he'd thrown on over his pajamas. As a senior instructor at Denver General's emergency medicine program, he maintained close contact with regional disaster response teams. His face was grim as he entered their apartment. "It's bad," he said without preamble. The fire started near Nederland, and it's moving southeast with unprecedented speed. The drought conditions and wind patterns are creating a perfect storm. They're calling it the worst fire threat in Colorado history. Gabriel looked up from where he was pressed against Jasper's side. "Uncle Marcus," he said. The boys had adopted the title on their own, recognizing something special about Marcus's role in their lives. "Help people?" "That's right, buddy. We're going to help people." Marcus knelt beside the couch, his voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you tell me what you're feeling right now?" The question was part of the protocol Dr. Rodriguez had established. When the twins experienced one of their episodes, moments when their enhanced empathy activated, the adults in their lives had learned to help them process and articulate what they were sensing. "Scared people running," Jasper said slowly, his 3-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts beyond his years. "Animals running too. Everything is hot and bright." "So many feelings," Gabriel added, pressing his hands against his temples in a gesture that broke Sarah's heart. "Too loud." In my head, Dr. Rodriguez had warned them about this possibility. As the boys grew older and their abilities became more refined, they might become overwhelmed by the intensity of emotions they could sense, especially during large-scale disasters. The psychologist had taught them techniques to help the twins manage the sensory overload, but this was their first real test. Sarah moved to sit between the boys, drawing both of them close. "Remember what Dr. Elena taught us," she said softly. "The feelings aren't yours. You're just borrowing them for a little while, like checking out a library book. Can you give them back?" It was a visualization technique designed to help empathetic children create boundaries between their own emotions and those they sensed from others. The twins had practiced it during role-playing sessions, but never under circumstances this intense. Gabriel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the way Dr. Rodriguez had taught him. "Giving back the scared," he whispered, "giving back the hot feelings." Jasper followed his brother's lead, and gradually their trembling subsided. But they remained pressed together, two small figures united against forces they could sense but not yet fully understand. Marcus's radio crackled to life, emergency dispatches, coordinating evacuation efforts and resource deployment. The twins' heads turned toward the sound with the same focused attention Sarah remembered from their infancy. They were still connected to the emergency, still aware of the unfolding crisis, even as they tried to process their overwhelming response. "To it. I need to go," Marcus said, standing and checking his equipment bag. "They're calling all available personnel to help with evacuations. But Sarah, David, if the boys are reacting this strongly, it means something significant is happening. You should document everything they say and do. Dr. Rodriguez will want a complete record." As Marcus prepared to leave for the disaster zone, Gabriel suddenly spoke up with startling clarity. "Blue house with white door. Lady with the cat." Everyone froze. The words were too specific, too detailed for typical 3-year-old speech patterns. "What? Blue house, Gabriel?" Sarah asked gently. "Can't find her cat," Gabriel continued, his voice taking on an odd, distant quality. "Smoke too thick. She won't leave without the cat." Jasper picked up the thread seamlessly. "Grey cat hiding under the bed in the back room. She doesn't know." Marcus stared at the twins, his paramedic training warring with the impossibility of what he was hearing. "Are you seeing this happening right now?" Both boys nodded solemnly. "Where?" Marcus asked urgently. "Can you tell me where this house is?" The twins looked at each other with that wordless communication that had characterized their relationship since birth. Then Jasper pointed toward the east wall of the apartment, toward the mountains, toward the fire. "Near the big rock that looks like a bear," he said. "Where the road turns twice," Sarah gasped. She knew exactly where he meant. A distinctive rock formation near a winding section of Highway 7, not far from where her grandfather's cabin had stood. She'd driven past it hundreds of times during childhood visits. Marcus was already on his radio, calling the dispatch coordinator. "This is Thompson. I have specific information about a potential rescue situation. Blue house with white door near Bear Rock on Highway 7. Elderly woman refusing evacuation, searching for a grey cat that's hiding under a bed in the back room." The response crackled through the static. "Thompson, how do you have this information?" "We haven't received any reports from that sector yet." Marcus looked at Sarah, then at the twins, who were watching him with those impossibly aware dark eyes. "Let's just say I have a reliable source. Can you get a team to check it out? We'll add it to the priority list, but we're stretched thin. Unless you can confirm this information through official channels—" "Do it," Marcus interrupted. "Trust me on this one." After he left, Sarah and David spent the rest of the night documenting everything the twins said and did. The boys provided a steady stream of specific details about the fire's progression, evacuation challenges, and individual situations that seemed impossibly precise for children who had never been to most of the locations they described. "Red truck. Stuck in the ditch," Gabriel reported around dawn. "Man hurt his arm trying to push it. 3 dogs in the shelter cage," Jasper added. "They miss their family." Each observation was delivered in the matter-of-fact tone children used to describe everyday occurrences, as if sensing distant disasters was as normal as commenting on the weather. Dr. Rodriguez arrived by mid-morning, having driven through the night from a conference in Phoenix after Sarah's urgent call. She set up a makeshift documentation station in their living room, recording the twins' statements with professional thoroughness while trying to hide her own amazement at what she was witnessing. This level of specific remote perception is unprecedented. In the literature, she confided to Sarah during a brief break while the twins napped, there are documented cases of empathetic children sensing general emotional states at a distance, but nothing approaching this level of detailed information. "Is it real?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her all night. "Or are they somehow picking up information from news reports or radio transmissions? We've controlled for those variables. The television has been off, the radio tuned to classical music, and their phones have been in airplane mode. Yet the details they're providing are extraordinarily specific and geographically accurate." The verification came in increments throughout the day as Marcus checked in from the field. The blue house with the white door existed exactly where the twins had indicated. The elderly woman Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, had indeed refused evacuation while searching for her cat, Smokey. The rescue team found the grey cat hiding under the bed in the back bedroom, exactly as described. The red truck belonged to a rancher named Bill Patterson, who had injured his shoulder trying to free his vehicle from a roadside ditch. The 3 dogs were German shepherds who had been separated from their family during the chaotic evacuation and were being temporarily housed in the animal shelter set up at the emergency command center. Every detail checked out with disturbing accuracy. "I've seen a lot of strange things in 30 years of emergency medicine," Marcus reported during his evening call. "But nothing like this. It's like having aerial reconnaissance from 2 3-year-olds who've never left Denver." The implications were staggering. If Gabriel and Jasper could truly perceive events at a distance during crisis situations, they possessed abilities that could revolutionize emergency response protocols. But they were also still small children who needed protection from the overwhelming nature of their own gifts. As the fire continued to rage over the following days, the twins provided a constant stream of information that proved invaluable to rescue coordinators. They identified trapped families, located injured wildlife, and pinpointed areas where the fire was likely to change direction hours before official weather predictions confirmed their insights. But the toll on the boys was becoming evident. They slept fitfully, ate little, and showed signs of emotional exhaustion from processing so much distant trauma. Sarah and David took turns holding them, using every technique Dr. Rodriguez had taught them to help create boundaries between the twins and the overwhelming emotions they were channeling. "We need to find a way to help them turn it off," David said, after a particularly difficult night when both boys had woken screaming about people trapped in a collapsed building, information that later proved accurate when rescue teams found a family sheltering in a partially destroyed ranger station. Dr. Rodriguez had been consulting with colleagues across the country, reaching out to researchers who studied exceptional abilities in children. The consensus was troubling. Abilities this powerful in children so young often came with significant psychological risks if not properly managed. "We're in uncharted territory," she admitted. "The boys need to learn control mechanisms much earlier than we typically introduce them. Otherwise, they could become permanently overwhelmed by the emotional input they're receiving." The turning point came on the 5th day of the fire, when Gabriel suddenly sat up in bed and announced, "It's going to rain." The weather forecasts showed no precipitation expected for at least another week. The fire conditions were only expected to worsen as dry winds continued to feed the flames. But 6 hours later, clouds began gathering over the Front Range mountains. By evening, the first drops of rain were falling on the fire zone, the beginning of a steady precipitation that would continue for 3 days and finally allow firefighters to gain control of the blaze. Gabriel and Jasper slept peacefully that first night of rain, their bodies finally relaxing as the distant crisis eased and the overwhelming flow of emergency emotions subsided. "They knew it was ending before nature did," Sarah whispered to David as they watched their sons sleep. "How is that possible?" "Maybe the same way they knew it was beginning," David replied. "Maybe they're connected to something larger than we understand, something that knows the whole story from beginning to end." As the emergency passed and normal life resumed, the family faced a new challenge: how to help 2 extraordinary little boys navigate a world that might never fully understand or accept their unique gifts. The fire had tested their abilities and proven their reality beyond doubt, but it had also shown the heavy price that came with such remarkable empathy. The boys who had been born in flames had survived their second encounter with wildfire, emerging stronger but carrying new questions about their purpose and their future. Their journey was evolving from survival to service, from miracle to mission, but they were still just children who needed love, protection, and guidance, as they grew into whatever they were meant to become. The hardest part, Sarah realized, wouldn't be helping them manage their abilities. It would be preparing them for a world that might need their gifts more than it was ready to understand them. 5 years after the Boulder County fire, Gabriel and Jasper Mitchell had learned to live with abilities that set them apart from every other child in their elementary school. At 8 years old, they had mastered the art of appearing normal while carrying within them an extraordinary burden of awareness that most adults couldn't comprehend. Sarah watched them walk toward Jefferson Elementary's front entrance on the first day of 3rd grade, their matching backpacks bouncing with each step, their heads tilted toward each other in the constant communication that had never diminished. To any observer, they looked like typical twins, identical in appearance but distinct in personality, with Gabriel's quiet thoughtfulness balancing Jasper's more outgoing nature. But Sarah knew better. She saw the way Gabriel's shoulders tensed when they passed the school's crisis counselor's office, where a child was crying behind closed doors. She noticed how Jasper instinctively reached for his brother's hand when they encountered Mrs. Peterson, the 5th-grade teacher whose husband had been diagnosed with cancer over the summer, information the boys had somehow absorbed without anyone telling them. "They're going to be fine," David said, reading the worry in her expression. "Dr. Rodriguez says their coping mechanisms are remarkably well developed for their age." That was true. Years of specialized therapy had taught the twins sophisticated techniques for managing their empathic abilities. They could now distinguish between their own emotions and those they sensed from others with impressive accuracy. They had learned to create mental barriers that protected them from being overwhelmed by ambient emotional energy. Most importantly, they understood that their abilities were both a gift and a responsibility that required careful stewardship. But elementary school presented new challenges. For the first time, Gabriel and Jasper would spend extended periods away from the family support system that had helped them navigate their extraordinary development. They would encounter children and adults who knew nothing of their story, their abilities, or the special accommodations they sometimes needed. The morning passed without incident, according to their teacher, Mrs. Angela Torres, who called Sarah during her lunch break. Mrs. Torres was one of the few school staff members who had been briefed on the twins' unique situation, a carefully managed disclosure that balanced transparency with the family's need for privacy. "They're adjusting beautifully," Mrs. Torres reported. "Both boys are obviously intelligent and well-prepared academically. Gabriel gravitates toward the quiet activities. He spent most of reading time helping Rebecca Mason, who's struggling with comprehension. Jasper is more social, but he seems to instinctively know which children need encouragement and which ones need space." It was a pattern Sarah recognized. Even as toddlers, the twins had shown an uncanny ability to read people's emotional needs and respond appropriately. Dr. Rodriguez theorized that their enhanced empathy naturally led to exceptional social intelligence, making them remarkably effective at providing comfort and support to others. The first real test came 3 weeks into the school year during a routine fire drill that should have been nothing more than a minor disruption to the day's schedule. Sarah was in a client meeting when her phone rang with a call from Jefferson Elementary's main office. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Principal Karen Walsh. Gabriel and Jasper are fine, but we need you to come to school immediately. There's been an unusual situation." Sarah's heart stopped. The phrase, "unusual situation," involving her sons could mean anything from a minor empathetic episode to something far more serious. She cancelled her meeting and drove to the school with mounting anxiety, imagining scenarios that ranged from embarrassing to catastrophic. She found the twins sitting in Principal Walsh's office, looking small and subdued in the adult-sized chairs. Gabriel was holding Jasper's hand, and both boys had the distant, slightly overwhelmed expression Sarah recognized as their response to intense, empathetic input. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside their chairs. Principal Walsh, a kind woman in her 50s who had been briefed on the twins' special circumstances, chose her words carefully. During the fire drill, both boys became extremely agitated. Instead of following evacuation procedures, they broke away from their class and ran toward the kindergarten wing. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The kindergarten wing was on the opposite side of the school from the twins' classroom. There would be no logical reason for them to go there during an evacuation unless they had sensed something the adults had missed. "We found them trying to open a supply closet door," Principal Walsh continued. "Inside, we discovered a 5-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, who had become separated from her class and was hiding, too frightened to come out." The principal's voice carried a mixture of concern and amazement that Sarah had heard before, from adults trying to process the inexplicable accuracy of her son's perceptions. "Emma has selective mutism," she continued. "She hasn't spoken to anyone at school since the year began, and she tends to hide when overwhelmed. Without Gabriel and Jasper, we might not have found her for hours. She could have been trapped in that closet until well after the drill ended." Sarah looked at her sons, who were still holding hands, and watching her with those impossibly mature eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for 8-year-olds. "Can you tell me what you felt?" she asked gently, using the language Dr. Rodriguez had taught them for processing their experiences. "She was scared," Gabriel said quietly. "Really, really scared, and alone. The scared was so big it felt like..." He struggled for words to describe the intensity, like when the fire was happening all over again, Jasper finished. But just for her, just in one small place. Sarah understood immediately. Emma's panic at being separated and trapped had triggered the same type of intense distress signal that the twins associated with emergency situations. Their instinctive response had been to locate and help the source of that overwhelming fear, just as they had during the wildfire. "Did other people notice what you were doing?" Sarah asked, concerned about how their classmates might have interpreted the unusual behavior. "Some kids thought we were playing a game," Gabriel said. "Mrs. Torres was confused, but she helped us open the door when we showed her where Emma was." Principal Walsh nodded. "The children don't seem to have found anything particularly strange about it. To them, it probably looked like the boys were just good at finding their friend." But Sarah could see the questions in the principal's eyes, the same questions that had followed the twins throughout their short lives. How had they known Emma was there? How had they located her so precisely? How did 8-year-old children develop such sophisticated rescue instincts? These were questions that couldn't be answered without revealing far more about Gabriel and Jasper's abilities than the family was comfortable sharing with school officials. "I'd like to meet with Emma's parents," Sarah said, making a decision that surprised herself. "If they're open to it." The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Carmen and Miguel Rodriguez arrived at the school with the wariness of parents whose child had struggled with anxiety and communication challenges since starting kindergarten. Emma, a tiny girl with enormous dark eyes, clung to her mother's hand while stealing curious glances at Gabriel and Jasper. "We wanted to thank your sons," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Emma told us, at home, where she feels safe to talk, that the boys found her when she was scared. She said they knew exactly where she was hiding. They helped her feel brave enough to come out." Miguel added, "Emma doesn't usually trust new people, but she says Gabriel and Jasper understand her feelings." Sarah watched her sons interact with Emma, noting the gentle way they approached her, the patience they showed when she communicated through gestures rather than words. It was clear that their empathic abilities allowed them to sense not just her distress, but also the specific type of support she needed. "Would you be interested in having the children spend some time together outside of school?" Sarah asked, following an instinct she couldn't quite explain. "I think they might be able to help each other." What began as playdates evolved into something more significant. Emma's selective mutism began to improve dramatically when she was around Gabriel and Jasper. The twins, in turn, seemed to find purpose and calm in their ability to help another child navigate overwhelming emotions. Dr. Rodriguez was fascinated by the development. "This could be exactly what the boys need," she explained during one of their regular consultations. "A way to use their abilities constructively while building normal childhood relationships." The friendship also provided valuable insights into how the twins' gifts might develop as they matured. Emma wasn't just benefiting from their empathetic support, she was beginning to exhibit heightened sensitivity herself, as if their abilities were somehow contagious or teachable. "She knew I was sad before I even walked into the room yesterday," Carmen reported during a parent meeting. "She's never been able to read emotions that clearly before spending time with your boys." It was a phenomenon Dr. Rodriguez had theorized, but never observed. The possibility that the twins' enhanced empathy could somehow activate or strengthen similar abilities in others, particularly in children who already showed signs of emotional sensitivity. The implications were staggering. If Gabriel and Jasper could indeed help other empathetically gifted children develop their abilities, they might be the first generation of what could become a new form of human consciousness. Children born with enhanced capacities for connection, understanding, and healing. As autumn progressed into winter, the informal support network around the twins began to expand. Emma's improvement encouraged other parents to seek out the Mitchell family, drawn by whispered stories of two remarkable boys who seemed to understand children's emotional needs with unprecedented clarity. There was Kevin Chen, a 7-year-old, who had been having nightmares since his parents' divorce, until Gabriel and Jasper taught him techniques for sending the scared feelings back to where they came from. There was Lucia Patel, whose panic attacks had improved dramatically after the twins helped her identify the specific triggers that set off her anxiety. Each success story brought new requests for help, and Sarah found herself struggling with decisions she'd never anticipated. Her sons clearly had the ability to help other children in ways that traditional therapy couldn't match. But they were still just 8 years old themselves, still learning to manage the burden of their own extraordinary gifts. "We need to be careful," David warned during one of their evening discussions after the boys had gone to bed. "They're developing a reputation. People are starting to talk about miracle children who can heal emotional trauma. That kind of attention could be dangerous." Sarah knew he was right. Already, she'd received calls from journalists who had heard rumors about the twins' abilities. Child psychologists from universities across the country were requesting permission to study Gabrielle and Jasper. A religious organization had even contacted them, claiming the boys were evidence of divine intervention in human evolution. The pressure was becoming overwhelming, and Sarah could see its effects on her sons. They were more tired than children their age should be, carrying the emotional weight of not just their own experiences, but those of every child they helped. Their childhood was being consumed by their purpose, and she wasn't sure how to protect them without denying them the chance to use their gifts. The crisis came in February, when a local news station ran a story about the miracle twins of Denver that included enough identifying details to make the family recognizable to anyone who knew them. The story was picked up by national media within hours, and suddenly the Mitchell family found themselves at the center of attention they had never wanted. The school parking lot is filled with news vans, reporters called constantly offering money for interviews. Strangers appeared at their apartment door, some seeking help for their own children, others driven by curiosity or skepticism about the boys' abilities. Gabriel and Jasper, who had always been unusually mature for their age, suddenly seemed very young and very vulnerable as they faced the intense scrutiny of a world that wasn't ready to understand what they represented. "We have to leave," Sarah told David, as they watched their sons peek through the blinds at the crowd of reporters gathered outside their building. "We have to find a place where they can grow up without being treated like circus attractions." The decision to relocate came swiftly, but the destination took more consideration. They needed somewhere remote enough to provide privacy, but civilized enough to ensure the boys received proper education and continued access to Dr. Rodriguez's specialized care. Marcus, who had become like family over the years, provided the answer. He had inherited a small ranch in Montana from his late brother, isolated enough to ensure privacy, but close enough to a university town to provide educational opportunities. "It's not running away," he assured them as they discussed the move. "It's strategic retreat. The boys need time to develop their abilities without the pressure of public attention. When they're older, when they're ready, they can decide how public they want to be." As they prepared for the move that would change everything once again, Sarah reflected on how far they had all come from that terrifying night in the burning cabin. Gabriel and Jasper were no longer just survivors of extraordinary circumstances. They were becoming something new, something the world might desperately need but wasn't yet ready to accept. The boys who had been born in fire were about to begin another chapter of their remarkable journey, carrying with them the hopes and fears of everyone who had witnessed their extraordinary gifts. Their story was evolving from miracle to mission, but the most challenging chapters were yet to be written. The Thompson Ranch sat in a valley between two mountain ridges in northwestern Montana, 40 miles from the nearest town of Whitefish, and a world away from the media circus they'd left behind in Denver. Sarah stood on the wraparound porch of the century-old farmhouse, watching Gabriel and Jasper explore their new domain with the boundless energy of 10-year-olds discovering freedom. The property encompassed 300 acres of rolling meadows, dense forest, and crystal-clear streams that had never known pollution. Marcus had spent the past 6 months preparing the ranch for their arrival, renovating the main house and converting the old bunkhouse into a state-of-the-art learning center, where the twins could continue their education without the complications of traditional schooling. "It's perfect," David said, joining Sarah on the porch as the boys splashed through a creek in pursuit of what might have been fish or frogs, or simply the joy of cold water on a hot summer day. They looked like normal kids for the first time in years, but even as Sarah felt relief wash over her, she knew that Gabriel and Jasper would never be entirely normal. Their abilities had only grown stronger with age, becoming more refined and focused rather than diminishing. The isolation of the ranch would protect them from unwanted attention, but it wouldn't change the fundamental nature of what they were becoming. The first test of their new environment came within a week of their arrival. Sarah was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when she heard both boys calling her name with an urgency that made her drop everything and run outside. She found them standing at the edge of the main pasture, staring intently toward the forest line about half a mile away. Their faces held the familiar expression of concentrated awareness that indicated they were perceiving something beyond normal sensory range. "There's a hurt animal," Gabriel said without taking his eyes off the distant trees. "A big one." "It's scared and in pain?" "Where?" Sarah asked, though she'd learned to trust their perceptions completely. Jasper pointed toward a cluster of aspen trees near the creek. "Past the white rocks, where the water bends. It's trapped and can't get free." David appeared from the barn, where he'd been setting up his home office, followed by Marcus, who had stayed to help with their transition to ranch life. Both men took one look at the twins' focused attention and began gathering equipment without being asked. They found the elk caught in a tangle of old barbed wire fence that had been forgotten in a remote corner of the property. The magnificent animal had struggled so violently to free itself that the wire had cut deep into its legs and chest. It was weak from blood loss and dehydration, its eyes rolling white with terror as it saw humans approaching. "This happened recently," Marcus observed, examining the scene with his paramedic's eye for detail. "Within the last few hours, but how did the boys know from so far away?" Gabriel stepped forward, moving with the careful confidence he'd developed when dealing with distressed creatures. "She was calling for help," he said simply. "Not with sound, with feelings." The rescue took 3 hours. Marcus used tranquilizer, equipment borrowed from the local wildlife management office, while David and Sarah carefully cut away the wire under his direction. The twins remained at a safe distance, but provided a constant stream of information about the elk's emotional state and physical condition that proved remarkably accurate. "Her fear is getting smaller," Jasper reported as the tranquilizer took effect. "She knows we're trying to help." "The hurt in her front leg is worse than the others," Gabriel added, "but she's going to be okay. She's strong." Dr. Amanda Walsh, the veterinarian who arrived to treat the elk's wounds, was amazed by both the animal's condition and the boy's insights. "I've never seen children so attuned to wildlife," she told Sarah as she worked. "It's like they can actually communicate with her." Perhaps they could. Sarah had stopped being surprised by the scope of her son's abilities, but she continued to be awed by them. The elk recovery became a symbol of what their new life might offer, the chance to use their gifts constructively without the burden of public scrutiny. As autumn arrived in Montana, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that took Sarah's breath away, the twins settled into routines that seemed both normal and extraordinary. Their education continued through a combination of online programs, specialized tutoring, and hands-on learning that took advantage of their unique environment. Dr. Rodriguez made monthly visits to monitor their development and adjust their coping strategies as needed. The psychologist was fascinated by how the rural setting seemed to enhance rather than diminish their abilities. "Their range has increased significantly," she reported to Sarah and David after observing the boys during a typical day. "They're now consistently sensing distress signals from distances that exceed anything we documented in Denver. But more importantly, they seem to have developed better control over when and how they respond." It was true. Gabriel and Jasper had learned to modulate their empathetic awareness like adjusting the volume on a radio. They could tune into specific signals when help was needed, but they could also dial down their sensitivity during rest periods to avoid being overwhelmed by constant input. The skill proved valuable during their first Montana winter, when severe storms isolated the valley for weeks at a time. The boys became an informal early warning system for the scattered community of ranchers and homesteaders who lived in the area. "Old Pete's having chest pains," Gabriel announced one morning in February, referring to a neighbor who lived alone on a ranch 5 miles away. "He's scared and trying not to show it." Sarah called Pete McKenna's landline and found him dismissive of her concerns, insisting he was fine and didn't need any fuss. But something in his voice triggered her maternal instincts, and she convinced David to make the difficult drive through snow-blocked roads to check on their neighbor. They found Pete conscious, but experiencing what was clearly the early stages of a heart attack. David's quick first aid and Marcus's emergency medical intervention kept the elderly rancher stable until helicopter evacuation could transport him to the regional medical center. "Those boys saved my life," Pete told everyone who would listen. "After his recovery, don't know how they knew, but they saved my fool hide when I was too stubborn to save myself." Word of the incident spread through the tight-knit rural community, but the response was different from what they'd experienced in Denver. Ranch families who dealt with harsh weather, dangerous wildlife, and medical emergencies miles from help understood the value of early warning systems. They accepted Gabriel and Jasper's abilities as a blessing rather than a curiosity. The twins began to thrive in ways Sarah hadn't seen since they were very young. They helped rescue lost hikers, located injured wildlife, and provided emotional support to children in the area who struggled with the isolation of rural life. But they also learned to fish, ride horses, and build tree forts like any other kids growing up in the mountains. Their 12th birthday celebration was held at the community center in Whitefish, attended by dozens of local families who had come to consider the Mitchell boys part of their extended family. Sarah watched Gabriel and Jasper laugh with their friends over birthday cake and presents, marveling at how normal the scene appeared despite everything extraordinary about their lives. But normalcy was a fragile thing, and Sarah should have known. It couldn't last. The disruption came in the form of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher from the Institute for Advanced Human Studies at Stanford University. She arrived unannounced on a spring morning when the boys were helping Marcus repair fence lines, claiming to be conducting research on rural emergency response systems. I'm particularly interested in communities that seem to have unusually effective informal networks for identifying and responding to crisis situations, she explained to Sarah over coffee in the ranch kitchen. Your area has remarkable statistics for emergency response times and successful outcomes. Sarah felt alarm bells ringing in her mind. Dr. Vasquez's questions were too specific, too focused on unusual phenomena and exceptional cases. This wasn't casual academic research. This was a fishing expedition designed to uncover information about Gabriel and Jasper. I'm sorry, but I don't think we can help you, Sarah said politely but firmly. We're just a normal ranch family. Nothing unusual about our emergency response capabilities. Dr. Vasquez smiled, but her eyes remained calculating. Mrs. Mitchell, I think we both know that's not entirely accurate. Your sons have abilities that could revolutionize emergency medicine, disaster response, and our understanding of human consciousness itself. Hiding them away in rural Montana is a disservice to science and to humanity. The direct confrontation sent ice through Sarah's veins. Somehow, despite their careful relocation and assumed privacy, they'd been found again. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah replied, but she could hear the weakness in her own voice. The Boulder County fire incident was documented extensively, Dr. Vasquez continued. Remote perception of specific emergency situations, accurate prediction of weather patterns, detailed knowledge of rescue scenarios they couldn't possibly have witnessed. That's not normal childhood development, Mrs. Mitchell. That's evolutionary advancement. Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened and Gabriel and Jasper entered, their faces immediately reflecting the tension they sensed in the room. Dr. Vasquez turned toward them with barely concealed excitement. These must be the famous Mitchell twins, she said, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Vasquez from Stanford University. I've come a very long way to meet you boys. Neither twin moved to shake her hand. Instead, they positioned themselves on either side of their mother, their expressions wary and protective. She wants to take us away, Jasper said quietly, his statement directed to Sarah rather than their uninvited guest. To study us like lab animals, Gabriel added, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old. Dr. Vasquez's eyebrows rose with professional interest. Remarkable. You're reading my intentions before I've even fully explained them. This is exactly the kind of phenomenon that needs systematic investigation. You need to leave, Sarah said, standing and moving protectively in front of her sons. Right now, Mrs. Mitchell, please consider what you're doing. These children could hold the key to the next stage of human evolution. By keeping them isolated, you're denying the world access to abilities that could prevent countless tragedies, save millions of lives, advance our species in ways we can barely imagine. The argument that followed was heated, but brief. Dr. Vasquez, left with promises to return with official backing, legal authority, and whatever resources were necessary to study the twins for the greater good of humanity. That evening, as Sarah and David discussed their options while the boys played quietly, in their room, Marcus made a suggestion that changed everything. "There are others," he said quietly. "Other families dealing with children who have unusual abilities. I've been in contact with some of them through my work with emergency services. Maybe it's time to stop running and start building something better." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "A community. A place where kids like Gabriel and Jasper can grow up together, learn from each other, and develop their abilities safely. Where families don't have to choose between protecting their children and helping them fulfill their potential." The idea was both terrifying and appealing. Sarah had spent years trying to give her sons a normal childhood, but perhaps normal wasn't what they needed. Perhaps what they needed was a community of people who understood their gifts, their challenges, and their extraordinary purpose. "There's a place in northern Canada," Marcus continued. "Private land, completely off the grid. A group of families has been quietly building a settlement there. Parents and children who share similar experiences to ours. They've invited us to join them." Gabriel appeared in the doorway, followed closely by Jasper. Both boys had the focused expression that indicated they were processing something important. "We want to go," Gabriel said simply. "We want to meet other kids like us." "It's time to stop hiding," Jasper added. "It's time to start becoming who we're supposed to be." Sarah looked at her sons, no longer the helpless infants she'd delivered in a burning cabin, but young men beginning to understand their extraordinary destiny. The fire that had forged them was calling them toward their next transformation, and she realized that her job as their mother was no longer just to protect them, but to help them embrace whatever they were meant to become. The decision to leave Montana was easier than she'd expected. The boys who had been born in flames were ready to step fully into their fire, surrounded by others who shared their gifts and understood their purpose. Their childhood was ending, but their real journey was just beginning. The settlement in northern British Columbia existed on no official maps, accessible only through a network of logging roads that wound deep into the Canadian wilderness. Haven, as the residents called it, nestled in a valley surrounded by pristine lakes and old-growth forests that had never known the sound of chainsaws or the footprint of development. Sarah felt her breath catch as their convoy of vehicles crested the final ridge and Haven spread below them. 40 families had created something extraordinary here, a community of sustainable homes powered by solar and wind, gardens that seemed to flourish despite the short growing season, and children playing in meadows with a freedom she'd almost forgotten was possible. But what struck her most was the sound, or rather the absence of it. No traffic noise, no sirens, no electronic hum of urban life. Just wind through pine branches, children's laughter, and the distant splash of someone swimming in the lake. Gabriel and Jasper pressed their faces to the car windows, their expressions mixing wonder with something deeper, a sense of homecoming that Sarah felt in her own chest. "There are so many of them," Gabriel whispered, referring to the children they could see scattered throughout the settlement. "So many like us." Dr. Margaret Chen, Haven's founder and a former Harvard neuroscientist whose own daughter had developed precognitive abilities, greeted them at the community center. She was a woman in her 60s whose calm demeanor spoke of someone who had learned to navigate extraordinary circumstances with grace. "Welcome home," she said simply, embracing Sarah, with the warmth of someone who understood journeys marked by both wonder and exhaustion. "We've been waiting for you." The integration process was unlike anything the Mitchell family had experienced. No media attention, no skeptical authorities, no need to hide or minimize the twins' abilities. Here, Gabriel and Jasper were simply two more gifted children in a community specifically designed to nurture exceptional development. The other children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, each carrying their own extraordinary gifts. There was Emma Rosewood, 15, who could communicate with animals with startling clarity. Marcus Littlefield, 13, possessed an intuitive understanding of weather patterns that made him the settlement's unofficial meteorologist. Twin sisters, Ana and Sofia Rodriguez, 14, could collectively see events happening hundreds of miles away, but it was 12-year-old Zoe Blackwood who became Gabriel and Jasper's closest friend. Zoe had been born during an earthquake in San Francisco, and the trauma had left her with an uncanny ability to sense geological instability, a gift that had led her parents to Haven after she accurately predicted 3 separate seismic events. "Your birth story is legendary here," she told the twins during their first week, as they sat beside the lake watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Born in fire, guided by intuition, saved by a mysterious rescuer who appeared exactly when needed. Dr. Chen says your story represents everything Haven was created to protect and nurture. The twins exchanged a glance, a silent communication that Zoe seemed to understand instinctively. "We never asked for any of it," Jasper said quietly. "Sometimes I wish we could just be normal kids." "But you're not normal," Zoe replied without judgment. "None of us are. The question is what we do with our gifts now that we understand them." That conversation marked a turning point for Gabriel and Jasper. For the first time in their lives, they were surrounded by peers who shared similar experiences, similar challenges, and similar purposes. They began to see their abilities not as burdens to be managed, but as tools to be developed and used constructively. The settlement's educational system was unlike anything in the outside world. Children learned traditional academics alongside courses in empathetic development, intuitive enhancement, and what Dr. Chen called conscious evolution, the deliberate cultivation of human abilities that were emerging in scattered populations worldwide. "You represent the next stage of human development," she explained to a group of older children during one of her regular seminars. "Not because you're superior to others, but because you're developing capacities that all humans may eventually possess. Your responsibility isn't just to use your gifts, but to learn how to teach them to others." Gabriel and Jasper thrived in this environment. Their empathetic abilities continued to develop, but now they were guided by teachers who understood the physiological and psychological implications of enhanced perception. They learned to modulate their awareness with scientific precision rather than intuitive guesswork. More importantly, they learned to collaborate with other gifted children to achieve results that exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. The first major test of their collective abilities came during their second winter at Haven, when a massive storm system threatened to isolate the settlement for weeks beyond their supply reserves. Traditional weather services predicted moderate snowfall, but the settlement's young meteorologists, led by Marcus Littlefield and supported by Gabriel and Jasper's empathetic reading of atmospheric conditions, foresaw something far more dangerous. "It's going to be a historic storm," Marcus announced during an emergency community meeting, "the kind that changes landscapes and strands communities for months, not weeks." The adults listened with the respect that the settlement's children had earned through consistent accuracy, and preparations began immediately. Emergency supplies were stockpiled, communication systems were tested, and evacuation plans were reviewed. When the storm hit 3 days later, it exceeded even the young meteorologists' predictions. Snow fell for 6 straight days, accompanied by winds that turned the landscape into an impenetrable white void. Several neighboring communities lost power and communications, but Haven weathered the crisis with minimal disruption. More significantly, the settlement's children had collectively sensed a group of cross-country skiers stranded in the wilderness 15 miles away. Using their combined abilities, Zoe's geological awareness to identify safe routes, the Rodriguez twins' remote viewing to locate the skiers, and Gabriel and Jasper's empathetic connection to assess their physical and emotional condition, they guided a rescue team to the exact location where help was needed. 8 people are alive today because of what you accomplished, Dr. Chen told the children afterward. This is what your abilities are meant for, not personal gain or scientific curiosity, but service to humanity in its moments of greatest need. As Gabriel and Jasper entered their teenage years, they began to understand the scope of what they were part of. Haven wasn't just a refuge for gifted children, it was a laboratory for human evolution, a place where the next stage of consciousness was being carefully nurtured and developed. The twins were now 15, no longer the frightened infants born in a burning cabin, but young men beginning to grasp their extraordinary destiny. Their abilities had evolved beyond simple empathy into something approaching telepathic connection with life itself. They could sense distress across vast distances, communicate with animals and even plants, and somehow tap into what Dr. Chen called the collective unconscious of human experience. But perhaps most remarkably, they had learned to teach these abilities to others. Under their guidance, several children who had shown only modest empathetic tendencies developed full-fledged intuitive capabilities. It was as if Gabriel and Jasper's presence somehow activated latent potential in those around them. "Your catalysts," Dr. Chen explained during one of their private sessions. "Your traumatic birth didn't just give you enhanced abilities. It made you capable of awakening similar abilities in others. That may be your true purpose." The realization brought both excitement and weight. If they could indeed help others develop enhanced consciousness, they carried the responsibility for potentially transforming human civilization itself. On their 15th birthday, the twins stood together on the ridge overlooking Haven, watching. The sun set over the pristine wilderness that had become their home. Sarah and David joined them, along with Marcus, who had become not just a family friend, but a bridge between their extraordinary past and their unfolding future. "Do you ever regret any of it?" Sarah asked her sons. "The fire, the abilities, the way your lives have been so different from what we originally planned." Gabriel and Jasper looked at each other with the wordless communication that had defined their relationship since birth, then back at their parents with expressions that held both the innocence of childhood and the wisdom of experiences beyond their years. "We were born for this," Gabriel said simply. "All of it, the fire, the gifts, Haven, whatever comes next. We wouldn't change any of it. Even the scary parts made us who we needed to become," Jasper added. "Mom, you gave birth to us in fire, because we needed to be forged by fire. Uncle Marcus appeared when we needed saving, because the universe knew we had work to do. Everything happened exactly as it was supposed to." As they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Her sons were no longer just survivors of impossible circumstances. They had become harbingers of human transformation, living proof that evolution could be conscious, deliberate, and beautiful. The twins, who had been born in flames, now stood ready to help kindle the light of enhanced consciousness in others, carrying forward the gifts forged in that burning cabin years ago. Their story wasn't ending. It was transforming into something larger, something that might eventually touch every human life on Earth. In the distance, the northern lights began their ancient dance across the Canadian sky, and Gabriel and Jasper watched with the serene confidence of young men who understood their place in the vast, unfolding story of human becoming. The fire that had brought them into the world continued to burn within them, no longer a threat to be survived, but a sacred flame to be shared with a world ready for its next evolutionary leap. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.